there was a young man playing the viola. It was the same guy, Ramzi Hussein Abu Redwan, and it, in a sense, captured the symbolism of the era, which is a moment of real hope in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Not everyone shared it, but many did, Palestinians and Israelis. They thought, finally, we're going to reach a state of what was often called coexistence. There's going to be peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and there'll be two sovereign states standing side by side. And in a way, Ramzi, coincidentally his name in Arabic can be translated as symbol, was a symbol for what was happening right then. And this picture was actually, this poster and these two photographs was a kind of metaphor for laying down the stone and creating the elements of a civil society. And in fact, it was an advertisement for the Palestine National Conservatory of Music, which is not something that you necessarily would think of first when hearing the word Palestine. But Ramzi was, again, sort of a symbol of that. And so I, at that time, decided I really have to meet this guy. I was on assignment for something else, but this was too appealing, too enticing a story. I had to figure out, like, what is the story behind this poster? So turns out he lived in a Palestinian refugee camp. There were many dozens of refugee camps created after the creation of Israel when 700,000, 750,000 Palestinians either fled or were pushed into exile in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere, Jordan. And Ramzi was raised by his impoverished grandparents, who themselves were exiles from a town called Nani, a village that no longer exists and didn't exist back when Ramzi was born in 1979. But by the time I met him, right after those posters went up, he spoke. I did a long piece for NPR about him, and I asked him, Ramzi, what's your dream? What do you dream about? What do you want to do with your life? He was starting to play music, but he was pretty much of a beginner. But he had this vision, and he said, you know what I want to do? First of all, I want to be play the viola in the First National Symphony of Palestine. And then what I want to do is open up music schools for all the children of Palestine. Now, for a kid from a refugee camp raised by his impoverished grandparents, it seemed like an unlikely thing to wish for. In a couple of months, he got, in fact, a scholarship to study in France, where coincidentally my brother, whose daughter is here tonight, lived very close to the place where the music was, where Ramzi was studying music. And I stayed in touch for a little while on visits to France, but then lost touch with him for about 10 years until the December of 2009, when I coincidentally ran into him in a restaurant in Ramallah, an Italian restaurant in the West Bank, and I hear my name being called from across the restaurant, and it's Ramzi. And I look over and I said, Ramzi, what are you doing here? And we greet, and he comes and joins us at the table, and he said, oh, well, I'm opening up music schools for the children of Palestine, which was really a remarkable thing. And I remember getting chills, and I kept grabbing his arm throughout the dinner saying, you did exactly what you said you were going to do as a child or as an 18-year-old. So he invited me to come the next day, and 5 years later, here I am, having documented his dream. And in a way, it was a dream that a lot of people share, this notion of hope. Ramzi had been one of the so-called children of the stones. He spent his life as an 8-year-old throwing stones at the soldiers, not simply in a way that sometimes is associated with these are delinquent kids, they're prone to violence. What they wanted to do with the stone is to expel the Israeli soldiers from occupied territory, and this was their means, the means that they found. And these kids, more than anybody else, youths and children, as young as Ramzi, 8 years old, were really on the front lines. And so when he put down the stone, he really saw picking up the viola as another instrument in the struggle to end the occupation and create a viable sovereign Palestinian state. And if you talk to him today, that's what he would say, that that's his struggle. But during that time, he and these other kids, they would race through the corridors and warrens of the camp and dodging soldiers and running from them and darting back and forth. And it was really a perilous existence and very traumatizing as well. But it was this transition that he eventually made to music that really changed his life. He had a dream of music from really only started that when he was a teenager, when he could afford to start thinking of that moment when he would be part of something that so many of us take for granted, which is freedom, democracy, freedom of movement. So that's what was happening then. Throughout the relations between Israelis and Palestinians, so much of a different picture than what you have today, so much more hope. And there was another couple of people that were sort of on a course to intersect with Ramzi. They were known. There are two people, Daniel Barenboim, who a lot of you probably have heard of, one of the most famous musicians in the world, Israeli musician, born in Argentina, and by chance, in the lobby of the Hyde Park Hotel in London, he met Edward Said, who is the famous intellectual, fierce defender of Palestinian rights, author of the famous, the classic Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism. He happened to have tickets that night to go see Daniel Barenboim, and Barenboim had just read Culture and Imperialism, and they struck up a conversation that continued, according to Daniel Barenboim, every day, he told me, until Edward eventually died in 2003. This was in about 95, but in 99 they had this idea, they finally developed this idea to start an orchestra between Palestinians, Israelis, other Arab musicians, and this became sort of also another symbol. And eventually Ramzi would join this orchestra, so I document a lot of that in the book. But it was really a moment of great hope and a sense that there really could be something beyond the sort of continuous history of tragedy, of loss and retribution, and loss and retribution. And I want to read something that's sort of it's a story I get into in the chronicle of Edward and Daniel's dream that eventually pulled in Ramzi. There was a night that Daniel and Edward were invited to the house of a family that had been, the husband was the president of Birzeit University in the West Bank and had been exiled for 19 years by Israel. And it was during this time that they were hoping he would get back, but basically Israel had banished this man, Hana Nasser, because of the ongoing activities during the occupation. The kids were demonstrating, the students were demonstrating, and they closed the school during the Intifada. But finally, he was allowed to come back. And Edward and Daniel came for dinner. Daniel was giving a concert in West Jerusalem and had invited the wife of Hana, Tanya Nasser, who herself was a classical musician, to come. And it was really an unprecedented moment of opening, an opening of the dialogue, of the connection, of the understanding between peoples. And yet it was at a time when already the settlements were intensifying. There was more and more settlements. So this whole invitation that Tanya had to go to Jerusalem to listen to this concert was really fraught with almost an unprecedented feeling of not having the ability to enjoy something when you've been in exile your whole life, and when she hadn't even been allowed to go to West Jerusalem In fact, she had to go to the concert, which she was invited to by Daniel Barenboim, by sneaking into Jerusalem. So I want to read a little bit about that, and then we'll get back to Ramzi's story. Tanya was struck by Daniel's concern and his respectful questions when they came for dinner that night. She told him about the years of shuttling their children between Birzeit and Amman. They needed travel permits, which required multiple stamps of approval from various occupation authorities, from the municipality, the police station, the Ministry of Education, the tax center, whatever, Tanya said. You'd have such long lines and all this waiting. There would be a soldier there, and if someone was out of line, he would start scolding us like children and kick us all out. We're finished now. Come tomorrow. That's when you really feel occupied. And there was a fear inside you that he would never stamp your permit, so you would shut up. And I would just burn inside because I had to get back to Amman, to my husband, to the children who had to get back to school. When Oslo arrived, Hannah said, the husband, Israel allowed him to return home. Tanya went to Amman to accompany him. Hannah pledged never to cry and kiss the ground upon his return like so many of the more sentimental refugees had done. The moment they crossed the Jordan and reached Palestinian soil, however, Hannah leapt from the bus in tears, kneeling down and kissing the earth. Right on the bridge, Tanya laughed. He was the first to go down from the bus. All these hundreds, thousands of Palestinian people who had been banished, who had been sentenced in exile, ex-fighters, were now coming back to the West Bank. And a lot of hope, again, for a new, independent, sovereign Palestinian state. And yet, there were the settlements that began and had begun in the 70s, but were intensifying at the same time. So there came the moment when, at the end of the evening, Daniel and Edward left and went back to Jerusalem, and Daniel reminded her of the invitation, Tanya of the invitation. She promised she would come. So late that next afternoon, Tanya climbed into the back seat of a taxi alone, heading for the first time in decades to the city of her birth. Hannah had also lived in Jerusalem as a child, and as she rode, Tanya recalled his old haunts, the Cinema Rex, the coffee shops, the YMCA where he had played tennis and studied Arabic typing, where his family had attended concerts by the Palestine Symphony, and where the Palestinian musician Salvador Anita had given his organ recitals. Now, without a permit, Tanya recalled, I had to come to Jerusalem in secrecy. I had to infiltrate it like an outlaw. Alone at the piano in the West Jerusalem concert hall, Daniel played the first notes of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony in B minor, the Pathetique. Tanya began to weep. She longed to disappear into the music, and for moments she would, only to be gripped by doubts over whether she should have agreed to come. An hour later, after Daniel had played the last notes of Liszt's Sonata in B minor, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Tanya and Edward rose too. Daniel walked forward, closer to the audience, spoke briefly in Hebrew, then switched to English. Last night I was in the West Bank at the home of a Palestinian academic who has recently returned from an unjust 20-year deportation by the Israeli government, Daniel said. He and his family received me not just as a friend, but more as a member of the family. Tanya was astounded. She and Edward looked at each other. In the silent auditorium, Daniel stood in the small pool of light. He spoke into the darkened hall, calling for peace, justice, and an end to the suffering on both sides. Suddenly, Tanya heard him say, I am happy to have my Palestinian hostess of last night with us here this evening. She has accepted my invitation to come to Jerusalem, despite prohibitions and many reservations. To thank her, I would like to dedicate my encore to her. Edward embraced Tanya. Only Daniel can do it, he said. Only he has the guts. Tanya was overcome with emotion, which grew deeper as Daniel sat down at the piano to play a Chopin nocturne. Daniel didn't know it, but this was the music Tanya loved the most. As a child in Ramallah, Tanya had danced to the nocturnes. So again, this was like a moment of intense hope for reconciliation, for some way of getting beyond decades of tragedy. And yet, at the same time, I began traveling to the region around this time. 1995, I think, was my first trip 20 years ago, of many trips. One of the things that astounded me as I began traveling around the West Bank was that there were these new roads like brand new, smooth as glass road that were being built in different parts of the West Bank. And I thought, well, why are these roads being built on what's supposed to be set aside for as a Palestinian state? These roads were reserved only for settlers and VIPs. At the beginning of the Oslo process, in the West Bank only, not including East Jerusalem, there were 109,000 settlers. Today there are 350,000. So the Oslo process did not prohibit the construction of all these settlements. And what's happened now in the interim is that there are so many checkpoints, so many barriers, roadblocks, partly to protect the settlements from Palestinian villagers, that the freedom of movement has been curtailed so severely that it's almost like if you look at a map of the grid of control, it's almost like an archipelago of islands, of semi-sovereign Palestinian islands in a sea of Israeli military control. Now that was also the case, but with fewer settlers back when Ramzi was throwing his stones, and later when the peace process began. And it's a term that Palestinians sort of bitterly referred to because they didn't actually receive any peace. And they did get the chance to come back, but in terms of a freedom of movement and in a sense of sovereignty and independence, they're still waiting. But meanwhile, Ramzi, despite all of this, he's still got this dream to go study music. And he gets this scholarship to study in France. And he's all this time, he's got this idea of creating music schools for the children of Palestine. But again, very little means, very little other than imagination, very few means to do it. And yet, as he studied in Angers, studied the viola, and he brought along his bouzouki, which is like a bouzouki, they call it in Greek. It's a cross between sort of a mandolin and a banjo. And he was doing a lot of Arabic concerts as well. He started a band. And as he started traveling around France and across Europe, he had this idea that he would use the concerts to share the notion of the school. And he would tell his story about throwing stones and how he had come to music and he wanted to use the music to help Palestinian children. And he started urging people, you know, if you have any spare instruments anywhere in your house or you know anybody, don't let them waste away in an attic or in your basement. Send them to us, and we will bring them to Palestine. And then he started getting pilgrims, Christian pilgrims, people, other people who are going to the Holy Land, to bring their instruments with them. And by this way, slowly but slowly, more and more instruments came, and eventually they shipped a huge shipping container of instruments. Meanwhile, Ramzi was raising money and trying to cajole people into cooperating with them. He got a lot of French musicians to come and with him as an experiment. Could this music school actually work? And it was one moment, probably in late 2002, when they were in Palestine and Israel were in the middle of the second intifada, a much more violent intifada. Suicide bombings, Israeli incursions. There was the terrible tragedy in Jenin where people were buried alive. And there was a sense that people had when they talked to Ramzi, and even Ramzi himself, why start a music school under these kinds of conditions? Is it really realistic? But at the same time, Ramzi wanted to try it out. So he went back home to his grandparents' place. He had been raised by his grandparents in Al-Amri refugee camp. And he decided to offer his music to the school, the United Nations school in the camp. And he noticed when he went there, they were sort of wary of the music and he was playing. The kids were drawing what they saw in their daily lives. They were drawing tanks with orange fire bursting out of it. They were drawing mothers crying. They were drawing checkpoints. This is what they were seeing in their daily lives. And Ramzi was really struck by that. You know, he said, you know, when I'm in France, and I go to school and play music, kids are drawing sun and moon and stars and houses and blue sky. But kids draw what they see and what they know. And he went away for a week and went, and decided to come back and give another performance for the kids. And this time they all gathered around. They were much more enthusiastic. And he looked at their artwork, and they were drawing musical instruments. And that's when he sort of had the faith to say that it was, even in a time of war, he was going to give it his best to actually open this music school. And after 3 more years, almost 3 more years, finally in 2005, they began. The first student at the school was this girl, Alat Shalalda. She was 7 years old at the time when this shipping container was finally opened, when it had come from France and all the way to the port of Ashdod in Israel, and then eventually to the West Bank. They unpacked all of these instruments, and this girl was standing there very wary. She and her family had been deeply traumatized during the Second Intifada. And she looked, at this piano as it was being unpacked, and the only reason she knew what it was is she'd seen one on a Tom and Jerry cartoon as a kid, or as a, she was a kid then, but as a little girl, and it was that unfamiliar to kids. Music was, Arabic music was familiar, but the kids didn't have instruments. They didn't know what a violin was. They didn't know what a piano was. But Allah wandered in one day when Ramzi had finally opened the school, and he took her into the instrument rooms that were empty at the time, except for filled with instruments, and she chose the violin. And it was at that point that Ramzi said to her, violin is really hard, and if you're going to play, you're really going to have to focus. And she said, I don't care. I'm going to play the violin, and I don't care how long it takes. I'm going to do it. But what Allah and her fellow students and everyone who teaches or learns music in the occupied West Bank knows, it's not so easy to learn music when you have to deal with checkpoints and barriers every day. The West Bank is a little bit smaller than the state of Delaware, the second smallest U.S. state. And there are, on average, somewhere around 600 checkpoints, blockades, other kinds of barriers to impede the passage. It's really such a landscape of tiny fragments, so that kids just going to a concert, performing and coming back, they're all subject to the series of checkpoints. And it really has a huge effect on their lives. At the same time, the music itself has helped transform them in terms of their own view of themselves. And I want to read another little section here to illustrate what I mean, because in this excerpt, it's sort of all happening at the same time. Allah and her sister, Rasha, were 2 of the first musicians, kids to take music lessons at Al-Kamanjati, which is the name of Ramzi's school. It means the violinist. So I'm going to read from a passage from spring of 2008. One evening, riding home from a concert in Bethlehem, Allah, Rasha, and a few of their fellow musicians suddenly came upon a military barrier erected hastily in the road. "Halt," commanded a sign in Arabic and Hebrew. Just beyond, an olive-clad soldier was checking documents. "Flying checkpoint," Rasha said. These were temporary barriers the military erected on the fly for the stated purpose of catching suspected militants and those without proper documents who might try to evade the fixed checkpoints. Also known as random or surprise checkpoints, they were so ubiquitous that Allah and Rasha were never surprised to encounter them. "It's normal," Allah said. And it's something that I am reminded of every time I go there. The occupation has been going on since 1967, the occupation of the West Bank. And this is all these children know. So when she says it's normal, she's not being ironic, or at least intentionally ironic. The things that we take for granted, just freedom of movement, these kids have never experienced. More than any single reality in Palestine, checkpoints to find life under occupation. By 2008, the number of flying checkpoints had reached 90 per week, part of the 630 closure obstacles Israel had erected across the West Bank, a territory the size of Connecticut. 3/4 of the main roads leading into the West Bank's biggest cities and towns were now blocked or controlled by checkpoints. Military authorities said the strict measures were necessary to protect Israeli lives. Palestinians and humanitarian organizations saw them as a means for Israel to control the occupied population and protect the movements of settlers who had illegally seized Palestinian lands. What was once justified by the Israeli authorities as a short-term military response to violent confrontations and attacks on Israeli civilians, declared a semi-annual UN report on the occupation, appears to be developing into a permanent system, a system which is fragmenting the West Bank territory and affecting the freedom of movement of the entire Palestinian population. Encounters at checkpoints could be deadly, but mostly for Allah and Russia, they were humiliating, dehumanizing reminders of who had control. At the flying checkpoint, the van carrying Allah and Russia slowed and came to a stop. The sisters gazed at the sign. Behind the soldier, a military Humvee blocked the road. The soldier beckoned the van forward. He opened the sliding door. "What's that?" the soldier asked Allah, pointing to her soft blue instrument case. "This is a violin," replied Allah, now 10 years old. The soldier told her to step out of the van. "Do you know how to play?" "Yes." "Play." "Don't play for him," Rasha yelled in Arabic. "Play," repeated the soldier. Allah frowned, looking into the van uncertainly. Muntasir, the clarinet player, said softly, "It's okay. Play, Habibti. Play, my dear." Ramzi's main purpose for founding Al-Kamanjati, he had said many times, was to protect the children from the soldiers. This statement often sounded like a slogan or a soundbite, but Allah, Rasha, and other children of Al-Kamanjati had begun to wear their music as a kind of armor. And I just want to pause for a second here to say that my niece Paraska, who's a PhD student at Penn, and his a brilliant researcher who did a lot of work and fact-checking and research for me on this book, dug out this amazing book, and I've cited the research many times. There are studies all over war zones of the effects of music on children, places like Bosnia, South Africa, apartheid under South Africa under apartheid, where children are not only protected for the time they're playing the music, but there's something actually transformative that happens. How music itself, and this is neurologists and musicologists and other social scientists who are making these conclusions, that it actually can transform the way somebody sees himself. That's really something that was reported to me not only by Ramzi, but also in a sense by the students themselves and by their teachers. So back to the checkpoint. Allah calmly removed her violin, placed it under her chin, stood erect, and began to play. She had chosen El Halwadi, or The Beautiful Girl, a song by Syed Darwish, made famous by Feiruz. Give me 1 second. A haunting melody floated from Allah's little violin, an oriental sound, as it was called in Israel and the West, certain and strong. Allah's notes cut through the low rumble of idling cars and floated above the flying checkpoint into the night air. We saw in his eyes he was shocked, Allah remembered. It was something he didn't understand. In the melody, the sisters could recall the words about a penniless child whose mood is serene, for she has put her life in God's hands. With patience, change will come. All will be better. Rasha, staring intently from inside the van, felt a surge of pride in her little sister, playing unfazed. "They claim that we are people with no identity, but Allah proved them wrong," she said. Music, Rasha believed, was not only a source of pride, it was a means of assertion, protection, and even at times vengeance. One second. And then the moment turned. Another soldier walked over to listen. He was smiling and seemed to be enjoying the impromptu concert. I play too, he said when Allah finished. May I try? Another soldier asked Amir, the guitar student, if he could borrow his instrument. The soldiers began to play, smiling at Allah and her fellow musicians, who gazed at them in astonishment. Suddenly to Rasha, the soldiers seemed like normal people. I do not know how they can do something like this, but at the same time treat people so badly, she said, genuinely confused. I don't know if they have two personalities or exactly how it works. Soon the van was on its way back to Ramallah, leaving its passengers to wonder who those soldiers were and what it might be like to meet them under different circumstances. And I want to just say a couple of words and show you some pictures and then get to your questions and make a couple of other observations perhaps. But I think different circumstances is what so many people are wishing for now. Not everybody. Some people, the status quo serves them, continuing settlement construction. But there are so many people of goodwill who want the two peoples to be able to live together and live together without hatred and without violence and without war. This is one effort. I'm going to show you some pictures now. Ramzi throwing a stone during the first Intifada. That's Ramzi on the left. During a moment in the first Intifada, they used to drag the rocks across the road, boulders, to prevent the soldiers from making incursions further into the camp. He's in the red coat there. There's the famous picture I referred to before, the poster. It was originally the Palestine National Conservatory of Music, and now they've redone the poster just with the name of Ramzi's music school. This is in the early days when Ramzi was trying out his idea of the music school, cajoling students, potential students, trying to see. This girl in the back is not really quite sure. Still, the jury is out. The curiosity, the total curiosity. An image of the occupation. These are women waiting to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This is a woman named Jessie, who is now an opera singer in Philadelphia. And she, at the time, taught herself Arabic singing, taught herself to sing in Arabic, even though she didn't speak Arabic. And she lived in France at the time and was a co-student with Ramzi at the conservatory. Ramzi playing for his grandparents. Ramzi, after a concert, impromptu concert with Yasser Arafat. During the second Intifada, Arafat was living in what they called the Muqata, which is his government compound that was under siege, and a lot of it had been bombed during the second Intifada by Israel, when Ariel Sharon was the prime minister. This is Al-Kamajati. This is this place that opened in August of 2005. There's Ramzi. This is not snow. After all, it is Palestine in August of 2005. The instruments were brought from France in this container ship and packed in between tires and foam and long sheets of white plastic paper, strips of paper, I should say, in plastic bags, which the adults dutifully stuffed in a dumpster. And the children had a better idea and took everything out of the dumpster. And this was opening night. And I end one of the sections of the book to say, in August in Palestine, it looked like snow. Another image of occupation. This is what one Palestinian fellow I know calls the chicken plucking machine. It is the barrier, the chute between, for pedestrians between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, if you can get a permit, that is. On the other side, facing north on the Jerusalem side, is a sign in 3 languages, Hebrew, Arabic, and English, that says, "May peace be upon you." This is one of the stars of Al-Kamajati, a singer named Odeh Khatib, who Ramzi kind of discovered in a refugee camp near Hebron. This is the first summer camp, 2007, in an Ottoman palace of an Ottoman governor that was built in 2002 for a governor of the Ottoman Empire. There's Celine Dagher, who is now Ramzi's wife, born in Lebanon and came to Palestine to be a volunteer, and now with Ramzi helps run the school. This is a place called Sebastia, which is an old amphitheater built by the Romans, and now has concerts of kids from Al-Kamajati and other people. And when I was there, there was a concert by French beatboxers doing hip-hop on looping iPhones, which is something that the older people found very confusing. And the children thought it was really great. These are men, Palestinian laborers with permits to work in Israel, waiting to be transported to their jobs as day laborers. This is on the West Bank, Israel border, photo taken by a member of a delegation of the World Council of Churches. One of the stars of Al-Kamajati sings Italian arias so well that once when he sang one in Bethlehem, the members of the Bethlehem Italian consulate rushed up to him and started talking rapidly to him in Italian. And he said, "I'm sorry, I need to get an interpreter. I don't speak Italian." This is his vocals teacher. A lot of people left their jobs. Pied Pipers, the Pied Piper Ramzi brought people like Julia, who left a budding opera career in the UK. There was a member of the London Symphony Orchestra who was looking for more meaning in his life and ended up quitting the orchestra and working with Ramzi. There's O'Day in France, triumphantly. He cried and asked for his mother all the time when he first landed. He was only 14, and he refused to have any of that terrible French stinky cheese. You know, he didn't want any of that stuff. That's a quote from him. This is Allah in a younger age. The girl's on the cover. The next first violinist of the Palestine National Orchestra. This is a story that's told in the book about the burning of the music school by unknown people. Ramzi thinks it was petty jealousy. Others think it may have been people with fundamentalist attitudes, not so prevalent in Palestine as it's sometimes portrayed, but certainly a factor. The response on the part of the teachers and the students was to go outside and play and say that we're not afraid, and they built the music school up again. There's been no incidents like that since that happened in 2009. A concert in one of the places called Batir, one of the old villages built long ago, thousands of years ago. It's one of the few places on the border of Israel and the West Bank that does not have the wall, partly because it's a heritage site of UNESCO because of its water aqueducts, ancient water aqueducts. Story of grief. The best friend of the clarinetist of Al-Kamajati was killed last summer by an Israeli soldier on the roof of a building in Ramallah during clashes. This is his son and widow. This was during the time that the Israeli teenagers had been kidnapped, and then tragically later it was discovered that they were murdered. This is the luthier, the violin maker and instrument repairman, who's the older brother of Allah and Rasha, Shahada, looking quite proud. This is Celine, who's now married to Ramzi. Another sort of picture of how the music enters you and maybe protects you. A funeral in Gaza, 2014, summer. Allah, the photo that's on the cover of the book. And Ramzi learned a lot of his green thumb from his grandfather, who always talked about the beauty of the village and when the certain crops would be coming in. And Ramzi sort of learned that almost by osmosis. And he's got quite a green thumb today. I'm going to stop there, and I know we have some time for questions, and I would love to hear any. I've got a few other observations I can make But I would like to first see if any of you have questions. We have someone is going to be handing out a microphone. Any questions? If not, I can keep talking. But well, as we're going along, I'll talk a little bit more. I want to also say, yes. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Hi there.
Hi.
I just want to know do you know what the name of the kind of cactus was a few pictures ago that was in the bottom left corner?
Well, not being a botanist, I'll have to go back.
It's just something I'd seen in association with
Where?
like
I don't
Palestinian
even
villages.
remember.
Maybe more a bit of a bunch more back, but it's like these oval. That one.
Oh, that one. Well, in Arizona, where I used to live, we would call that a prickly pear. I think that's a prickly pear cactus. So, I've never had a vegetation question for this. That's the first. Yes, there's a question back there.
So it would seem that ordinary citizens of both Israel and Palestine would be thrilled to have peace between them. So what fundamentally is wrong? What is the problem?
Yeah.
Is it the governments? What, in your opinion, is preventing peace?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, first of all, I think one of I'm going to answer that on two levels. I think one of the problems is in understanding and perception here in the U.S. With many fine exceptions, I would say that the sort of overall story that we have, Jew and Gentile alike in this country, and again with fine exceptions, including the work of someone like Ben Hubbard in the New York Times from Gaza last summer. But generally, what we have is, I would say, the sort of what I call the Leon Uris history of the Middle East, as told in the book Exodus, which is to say that the heroic birth of Israel out of the Holocaust, but the Arabs, which is to say the Palestinians, their story is they're either portrayed as terrorists or as malicious or pathetic or non-existent. There was a phrase in a lot of the recruiting back in the day of before Israel was created that people without land go to a land without people. In other words, Jews would go to this empty land from Europe. Well, there were hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living there. So in a way, that remains the kind of narrative, is that we all know and identify in America, especially in the press, that Israel needs to be secure. Israelis need to be safe. That's something that's well understood. But what's not understood is that other reality. And people don't know the effects of the occupation on grown-ups and children and like the incredible hardship. To me, one of the things that needs to change is that fundamental understanding of how life is lived under occupation and how much worse it's gotten over the last 20 years. You're asking about what do I think the problem is. I mean, I think the main problem is that what was set aside as a Palestinian state, supposedly under Oslo, was the West Bank and Gaza with a corridor in between. Right now, that land has been so taken over by settlers, Israeli settlers, in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, such that imagining a state, I mean, you have a settlement of 20,000 in the middle of the West Bank. And the settlers and their supporters, which include a lot of Christian fundamentalists from America who believe that Israel must be in control for the second coming of Christ. There are millions of people who share these beliefs. That alliance has created basically a carte blanche for Ariel Sharon and now Benjamin Netanyahu in particular to continue the settlement. Part of the problem is the United States hasn't, even though Israel, you could say, is a client state of the U.S., we give them $3 billion a year and not the other way around. You would think that we would have some influence, and yet it's been since before Oslo in 1992 that any American president or Secretary of State told Israel, you better stop building settlements or we might not be giving you money. It was James Baker in 1992 who said that as Secretary of State to Yitzhak Shamir, the Prime Minister of Israel. And he's basically saying, it's up to Mr. Shamir. If they want to continue building settlements, we will not extend $10 billion in loan guarantees. And that stopped immediately. That, I think, part of the problem there is that the influence of what's known as the Israel lobby, especially the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. There's a brilliant article by a woman named Connie Brook in the New Yorker back last September that documents just how influential they are in the Congress in bundling campaign contributions. And it's sort of like the NRA. They are extremely influential, and this has really crippled a genuine democratic exchange, which includes an understanding in the press. I think if people knew if Americans knew what was happening in their name in terms of tax dollars, this would not abide. And I think what does need to happen is, at this point, it's probably, Netanyahu famously said, I won't allow a two-state solution. Well, I mean, he was being honest in the sense that it's probably beyond what's possible. So now what you have is a one-state reality, but some of those people have rights and some people don't. So I think what needs to happen now is to acknowledge that the two-state solution is probably not possible anymore, and now the question has to shift to a question of rights. You can't have people living indefinitely in an unequal state. There's been a lot of controversy in the past. Jimmy Carter came out with a book called Peace or Apartheid about the region, and people got very angry with him. People don't like it when you say, it's a Jim Crow reality, Palestinians are living. To me, I don't prefer any particular language, but it is separate and unequal, and that can't abide. Long answer to your question. Anybody else with a question? Yes, please. I think we're waiting for...
Well, first of all, I want to say on a personal note, my name's Elaine, and I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin originally.
So am I.
I know, because I spent many hours in your home playing with all of you. Kathy was one of my best friends.
Oh,
your
my
sister.
gosh.
So,
what's your last name?
Seelan. And we're on Facebook. So.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, okay, we don't have to get into all this right now.
But I just wanted to say that just lovely memories of the Tolan family.
Okay, thank you.
One of the things I noticed in the photograph of the men that look like mostly men corralled in that cage, and the irony of that image with the Holocaust. It's hard not to make a comparison of the irony of that kind of, cattle-like effect. And I wonder if that's ever talked about, or the kind of...
There are people who make that analogy. I think what's happening to the Palestinians in terms of the occupation is completely unjust and unfair, and the occupation has to end. But I personally don't think Holocaust analogies are particularly useful, because it brings up a certain level of defensiveness, understandably, because that was horrific in a completely different way. So I don't use that. I know other people do and defend it, and I understand that they do. But and if people infer from that picture a certain memory, then so be it. But that's my response to that. Yes, questions?
A brief anecdote, and I'll ask you to comment on it. We were in Israel a month or two ago for a couple of weeks doing a little look around, and it was interesting listening to a New York Jewish immigrant who's a Zionist Israeli now said, there's a lot of nice people among the Arab population. The problem is our leaders don't have anyone to talk to, or we could have peace. And then later on, I was in East Jerusalem. We were in East Jerusalem. We were talking to some Palestinian Israelis. And, I said, what's going on? Do people get together to play music? Do they interact? You're here in your store. You deal with the tourists and everyone else that comes through.
Yeah.
And he says, the people are fine. Everybody gets along really well. The problem is our leaders don't have anyone to talk to.
Yeah, yeah. I understand that. I mean, I think, there was a time, which I referred to earlier in my readings, that there was all this hope, and that there were people talking to each other. I mean, I think what's happened in the last 20 years, this is maybe a partial answer to your question, is the Oslo era brought all this hope, brought all this notion of two people living together in states side by side, partly because of what I described with the huge transformation of what it's like on the ground. This looks less and less possible. And at the same time, the conditions really have been created by Israeli advancement into what was supposed to be a Palestinian state, and the United States allowing that to happen. So we get to this sort of impossible situation. So what's happening now is that the Palestinian strategy has shifted. Yes, they say we don't have a partner, and Israel continues to say that sometimes as well, although the U.S. blamed Israel basically for the last collapse in peace talks, which is unusual. So what you see now is a different shift in strategy on the part of Palestinians. On the government side, they're going directly to the United Nations and the International Criminal Court to try to unilaterally create the conditions for their own freedom because, as you say, they don't feel like they have a partner. And at the same time, the whole era of dialogue has given way to what's sometimes called BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And people, and Presbyterian Church, for example, has divested, in Caterpillar, which has plowed under hundreds of thousands with the bulldozers like the D9 and other bulldozers, hundreds of thousands of olive trees, and destroyed thousands of Palestinian homes under demolition orders. So the notion, the idea is now to seek nonviolent, I'm not talking about Hamas right now, but I'm talking about nonviolent direct confrontation in the international arena. That's the new strategy, and I think people have pretty much gone beyond the notion of even trying to get the other side to reason. I know we've got to stop in just a moment, and I just wanted to say that my niece Paraska has, we're trying to bring Ramzi here in late, well, he's actually going to come. We're putting together some venues and some concerts, and we're going to try to bring him back next spring. And Paraska has some flyers if you're interested, and if you know of a venue or if you know somebody who might be willing to support this in the future, there's phone numbers, and please take a flyer. And other than that, should we wrap her up? One more minute, if anybody has one more question. Otherwise, thank you very much.